Cool fact, a crocodile can't stick out its tongue. Also, you can get health insurance for a month or just under a year in some states. United Healthcare short-term insurance plans, underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage for you. Learn more at uh1.com.
There's never been a faster or easier way to start your weight loss journey than with PlushCare. PlushCare accepts most insurance plans and gives you online access to board-certified physicians who can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Take charge of your health and speak with a board-certified physician about a weight loss plan that's right for you. Get started today at plushcare.com/weight loss. That's plushcare.com/weight loss. plushcare.com/weight loss.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, Randy.
Since we founded Bombas, we've always said our socks, underwear, and T-shirts are super soft. Any new ideas?
Maybe sublimely soft.
Or disgustingly cozy.
Wait, what?
I got it. Bombas. Absurdly comfortable essentials for yourself
and for those facing homelessness.
Because one purchased equals one donated.
Wow, did we just write an ad?
Yes.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase.
Hello folks, welcome to Wargaming Month here on the Napoleonicist. A very quick reminder, smack the like button, remember to subscribe so that you can find your way back, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It'll take you a few seconds of your time. It'll make a massive difference to me and my ability to reach a wider audience with the details of the work of my fantastic guests. If you are willing to go just a tiny bit further and dig into your own pocket, and believe me, I completely understand if you're not up for that, you can do so in two ways. You can become a regular supporter via Patreon, different perks in each tier, check the link in the description for more details on that, or if a regular subscription isn't your thing, you can leave one-off tips via Ko-fi. Again, the link is in the episode description. Whatever support you're able to offer, as you know, I am massively grateful, and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to the Napoleonicist and another instalment of Wargaming Month. Today we're going to keep exploring the genre and take it in a slightly different direction. We're looking at the different sort of variations that you get when it comes to the world of wargaming. So we'll look at board games in a future episode. There's a whole sub-series over on the YouTube channel which is looking at the digital war game, as I'm joined by Josh Proven to talk about Napoleon Total War. But today we're going to delve into the world of miniatures. How could we not? You know, there's nothing, in my mind at least, that captures the essence of wargaming than those little plastic figures, sometimes beautifully painted, in my case, most definitely not beautifully painted, and the whole kind of world of rule sets and landscapes and so on that kind of coalesces around that. To help me understand all of this, I'm joined by Chris Pramas, who's a 29-year veteran of the tabletop game industry. He is the founder and president of Green Ronin Publishing, now in its 22nd year. He's been playing miniature war games since the early 80s and was a founding member of Wizards of the Coast Miniatures division at the turn of the century. He co-designed its Dungeons and Dragons chainmail game and created its fantasy setting on top of it all. And he's also written 3 books for Osprey Publishing, which frankly is a hell of a CV. I'm tired just kind of running through it all. Chris, welcome to the Napoleonicist. Great to see you. How are you doing?
Hello. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm doing all right. You know, just trying to keep on keeping on with the world being increasingly challenging, shall we say?
It doesn't seem to get any easier, does it? There are many memes that circulate over each new year about, okay, maybe we can just kind of get the year right this time and do things properly, and it just all goes to hell very rapidly. Let's start with this wargaming malarkey with you, as I have done with all of my guests, because this is a personal route in for many people. So, you know, what was yours? How did you become submerged in the world of miniatures wargaming?
Well, so I've always liked history for starters. And, you know, when I was a lad, I would watch old movies on my black and white TV. in the 70s. And that's where I first saw stuff like the Waterloo movie and To Hell and Back, which was Audie Murphy's autobiographical World War II movie, and Zulu, things like that, that kind of stoked my interest in military history. And then, I don't know, 76, 77, something like that, I started to collect sets of Airfix miniatures, like many. And I had no notion of gaming with them. Like, I would set them up, do the sort of like battles that kids do with them. But, I had no notion that there was like rules and games that you could play with them. So then when I was 10, basically two important things happened in my life. First, I read Lord of the Rings, and second, I got into Dungeons and Dragons. And D&D was kind of my gateway into what are variously called hobby games, adventure games, and tabletop games now, to differentiate from computer games. So I started with that. And at the time, miniatures were an extremely important accessory for D&D. When you go into stores, there'd be miniatures from like Grenadier and Ralpartha and Heritage, just hanging right there with the D&D stuff. And you use them to run your encounters, so you could see where everyone was and a mini war game essentially when you were in combat. And I just thought miniatures were like the best damn thing. It's like, oh man, these are so cool. I love these. So I started collecting those, and D&D was like a bridge for me. I started to subscribe to Dragon Magazine, and it later became kind of a house organ for D&D, but back at that time, it still covered like a variety of games. And so that's what introduced me to the larger concept of miniatures games. It's how I learned about Avalon Hill board war games and that whole scene, and got into doing that stuff. And eventually TSR published a game called Battle System, which was basically the Dungeons and Dragons miniatures game. And what nice thing about it was that it came with cardboard counters. So if you didn't have a miniatures force, you could try the game just using the counters on the kitchen floor, which is what I did. So, that was really when it was like, oh yeah, like miniatures gaming. I want to do more of this. So when I was in college, I started playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and that tied into Games Workshop's Warhammer Fantasy Battle game. And in some of the role-playing scenarios, they would say, if you want to do this big fight in a castle with our miniatures game, here's how to do that. And so we did that. My friends and I, when we were playing through these campaigns and things, and that was basically when the hook was really in. So it took me till the 90s to really get into historical miniatures games. I was also going to grad school then, where my plan was to get a PhD, become a historian, become a professor, that kind of stuff. But I started to do freelance writing for role-playing games. And when you're like, oh, I need to do this paper for school, or I could write this gaming thing, which is not only fun, but pays me, like that kind of won out in the end. And that's how I started my career. Yeah, that's that's my long route forward. I will also give a shout out to a book called Epic Land Battles, which I got when, I don't know, I was 11 years old, something like that. It was one of those big oversized history books that you see, that has lots of like period pictures and maps and so on. And that book ran from like Yorktown to Kursk, I think. But amongst the battles covered was both Austerlitz and Waterloo. And that was really the first time that I was like read in detail about a Napoleonic battle, looked at the maps, all that kind of stuff. So it's also a good influence.
I can fully understand the temptation to go and write things that actually you get paid for.
Yeah.
Because as I whine about very often on this podcast, history does not pay well. Love it though we do. We do not do it to get rich quickly, because that's not the name of the game when it comes to this business. There's a lot for us to get our head around here, isn't there, in the world of miniature games, because there are a number of different rule sets, possibly too many for us to go through in their entirety. But talk us through how some of the headliners, shall we say, kind of work, and how do they vary in terms of the way in which they try to recreate an environment that, as we've discussed in other shows, it's very hard. It's impossible to create an actual battle, and you wouldn't really want to create an actual battle. You're trying to create something that's fun. So how do they try and inject a flavor of this period into what's being played out on the tabletop?
All right. Well, first, quick note, game industry actually pays terribly. So that was, maybe the joke was on me in the long run. But anyway, so miniatures games. So, I mean, Napoleonic ones in particular, like there are just literally hundreds of them, like whenever I'm at a convention and I'm looking like in the bring and buy area, I'll be like, oh, look, it's like 4 other Napoleonic games from the 70s I've never heard of, so the choices are vast. So basically, there's a lot of things that you need to decide like before you're going to get into one, and rules have different ways of treating things. So like a fundamental part of it is like, what type of engagement are you interested in simulating? So you can do anything from a skirmish game with like a dozen miniatures representing one guy per miniature, up to the grand tactical, where one miniature could represent 120 or more guys, and your maneuver elements are going to be different depending. Could be a company, could be a battalion, so you first should decide like what it is that you want out of the game, and that helps narrow down the games that are going to be available to you. And so essentially, you got to find the right kind of game for yourself, and you need to decide on a miniature scale. And so some games are very specific, like this is for 28 millimeter miniatures or 15 or what have you. But like there's so many different miniature scales, and so many rules are also like, well, if you want to play in 6 millimeter or 10 millimeter, like here's how to convert things and what have you. So before you start collecting, you kind of need to have a sense of that, which means finding the rules that are going to work with your budget and all that stuff. So in nearly any miniatures game, there's a bunch of things that you want to simulate. So at a fundamental level, you want to know how to move your miniatures on the table. You want to know how they can fire their weapons. You want to know how they can engage in hand-to-hand combat. And then you want to deal with morale in some way, because there's a tendency when playing miniatures games to just keep playing until one side is just absolutely demolished, but that's not how battles usually are, right? Like if you take 25% casualties across your army, chances are, you're gonna hoof it at that point. So, and then some games, particularly Napoleonic ones, command is also an important part of it. Do you have sub-generals? How are you commanding the units and that kind of stuff? So basically, like those are all kind of dials, and different games approach every one of those things in a different way. And the complexity of the games goes from extremely simple to like mind-bogglingly complex. So, there's some research involved. Each game will have like a turn structure, which tells you like basically an order of operations. What do you do first? And these days, it's typically like move, shoot, assault. That happens in many games, but some games do it differently. Some games will let you, fire first and then move. And it really depends on the designer's intent. So there's a lot of moving parts, I guess, is, is what I'm trying to say. So you just need to find your entry point. And I can get into specific games at some point if you want to.
Yeah, well, let's go for that. What are the big names out there? I mean, we've talked on the greatest inverted commas debate on Wargaming's about Black Seas, part of the sort of the Black Powder franchise, but there are plenty of others out there. So just talk us through some of the key players.
Yeah, sure. Like if you're just getting into it, a very useful book that I recommend is called Napoleonic Wargaming by Neil Thomas. It's pretty widely available. You can get it off Amazon, things like that. It's an introduction to Napoleonic miniatures gaming. And what's nice about it is, it kind of gives you a little potted history of the conflict, but then, there's chapters about the strategy and tactics of the period, just so you kind of know what you're going to simulate. And then there's a pretty simple set of rules in it as well, where the rule section is 8 pages. So it's not that difficult to grasp. And then there's a bunch of supporting material and a nice bibliography, which doesn't just list games and books, but actually comments on them. Like, this is why this is useful. And, so it's a nice starting point to get yourself into the period. And then, if you decide that that's a good level of complexity for you, well, you can just play that. But if you want to get deeper into it, then there's lots of choices. You mentioned Black Powder, which is one of the big dogs. That's from Warlord Games. You should get the core book of this game pretty much, I think, regardless, because it is so beautiful. It's a big aspect of miniatures gaming is the spectacle of it all. The Warlord people are largely ex-Games Workshop folks, and so the whole thing they want to do was recreate big battles with tons of miniatures on big tables. And so it's full of pictures of these just gorgeous boards, beautifully painted miniatures, and if you want to understand what's the attraction of this hobby, just page through Black Powder, you'd be like, oh, I see. And the rules are pretty easy to get into. Right. So beyond that, there's a whole group of what are called large scale skirmish games. These are games that generally require only 50 miniatures per person instead of potentially hundreds and hundreds if you're going to do a bigger scale game. Popular one is called Sharp Practice. That is from Two Fat Lardies. The limitation of that one is that the lists in the book only cover the Peninsular War. So if you want to game that, it's great. Presumably there's going to be a supplement with more army lists, but I haven't seen it. That is sort of the model. You publish a core game and then you provide specialized supplements about different armies or campaigns or what have you. More recently, there's a game from Studio Tomahawk called Shakos and Bayonets. This is actually a supplement for one of their core games, which is called Muskets and Tomahawks. And as the name indicates, that was originally designed as a French and Indian War / American War of Independence game. But in the second edition, they kind of broadened it out to the Black Powder period in general. So Shakos and Bayonets is the book that gives you all the Napoleonic details about that. I've played a bunch of Muskets and Tomahawks. I've only had a chance to play Shakos and Bayonets once at a convention last year. But anyway, Studio Tomahawk, they do nice games. They also do Saga for medieval stuff, which is great. Then Osprey, they have a series of these blue covered shorter miniatures games, generally 64 to maybe 96 pages. Also kind of a nice entry point because first of all, they're cheap. You can get them for $20 or less. And, secondly, they don't tend to be extremely complex. So they did one a few years ago called Chosen Men, which I'm sure you can't possibly imagine what the inspiration for that title was.
I am completely flummoxed. What could it be related to?
I know. Yeah, that is similar sort of scale to those other games. And its force lists, they cover the Peninsular War and the 100 Days, but not beyond that. You'll notice amongst the British miniatures companies, of which there are many, of course, they tend to favor those two campaigns for obvious reasons. Other games provide more, more broader support for the major powers, at least. Then you have more like divisional scale games. So General de Brigade is one of them. That's from Partisan Press. And then there's an American designer named Stan Mustafa who publishes a series of games called Honor. And each one of them is named after a commander and is about a different conflict or level of a conflict. So like his American Civil War game is called Longstreet. And he's got two Napoleonic games. One is called La Salle, and that's like a division level game. It's medium complexity. So, there's more to it than some of the lighter games, but it's not, it's not a bear like some of the older games. And then he also does a game called Blucher, which is interesting because you actually don't need miniatures to play it. It is designed basically at a grand tactical level. And you have these unit cards that give you stats for the different units you're going to have on the board. And they provide all of those for free. And they have the footprint of the unit size in the game. So if you want to try it before investing, $1,000 in miniatures, something like that, you could just print out those things and play the game with just that. So it's a nice way to give a pretty reasonable grand tactical game a try without a big investment. Then there's a bunch of naval games. I think you mentioned Black Sails. And I should also mention Sails of Glory from Ares. They are a company that really cracked like air warfare, like particularly World War I stuff, with a very innovative movement system. And what was really nice about it is that the planes came pre-painted. So Sails of Glory is the same concept, but it's Napoleonic warships. And so you can buy individual models of all different ships. Usually each model will be like one of two different ships you can play it as. And you can just get that on the table as soon as you get the ships. So that's nice. As you might expect, like running a ship of the line is a lot more complicated than like a one-seat fighter. So there's more to it than playing an air war game. But it provides a great a great looking game, just like right out of the box. So yeah, that's a little bit of a view of what's going on.
And there's a hell of a lot going on. So how does it stack up compared to other types of war games in terms of popularity?
So this has gone through different phases, I guess you'd say. So currently, it's like in historical gaming circles, Napoleonic is kind of midland, because rank and file games are a little bit out of favor with many modern gamers because they seem sort of like antiquated. They'd rather play a skirmish game. World War II has become really popular in the last 15-ish years for that and other reasons. But there's always been this strong Napoleonic part of the audience. The one challenge is that people who are into Napoleonic games, they're not all, but there's a tendency for them to be older gamers. And so, that can be off-putting to people. Other than the skirmish games and some of the exceptions that I talked about, it's an investment. If you're really going to do like large scale games, then it requires a lot of minis and, either you painting or hiring a painter, to get things prepared. So, it has, I guess, more hoops than many games, but there's still always just a fascination with Napoleonic wargaming. So, it has many adherents as well. I don't want to undersell it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you get much crossover with the Warhammer crowd? Because somebody was telling me fairly recently about, let's call it an unusual game, which was half historically based and then half just had random fantasy stuff like zombies thrown in, which left me really sort of scratching my head. So do you get people who sort of come from the Warhammer, whether it be I'm going to embarrass myself here with my lack of knowledge, but the more fantasy based stuff, or with the whole sort of Space Marines and the 40k and so on? Or do you find that actually there's a boundary and people sort of either come for this because they are into other types of historical war games, or they come to this for the historical, I want to do Napoleonics type of thing? Are there distinctions, or is it just kind of, as with most things, a mishmash?
Well, so with a lot of popular games, you have lots of people who get into it, decide this is my game, and they just don't really stray from that. So a lot of people who play like Warhammer 40k or Warhammer Age of Sigmar these days, like that's their game, that's where they're going to play. But there are, a goodly number of people who spend some years in that community. They may even stay in that community, but they also want to broaden out, and it is a not uncommon path to start with Warhammer and get into historical games. That's what I did. And part of that comes from the culture of Games Workshop itself, because the original designers and their staff, definitely through the 80s, and longer, like they love historical stuff. There's a lot of historical influence on Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which is the original Warhammer game, where you can see these like miniatures for a fantasy game that are obviously based on historical things. So like there was an army called the Empire that was like similar to the Holy Roman Empire. And the core troops of that, they're Landsknechts, right? Like that, that's what they are. You'll also find like Polish winged hussars in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So that influence was always there, but also, like so many of those people came out of historical gaming to start with. So as those folks have retired, many of them have gone over to the historical side for publishing and for making miniatures. And so that's where you have like the Perry twins with their company Perry Miniatures and Warlord Games, which I mentioned. Like the Perrys are one of a kind, I guess you'd say. Like they've probably sculpted more miniatures than anyone like ever, just thousands and thousands of thousands, first for Games Workshop. And then with Perry, they went into the historical stuff. And, they've got a huge range of Napoleonics, lots of different historical stuff, both pewter and plastic kits. And because they're just like keen students of military history, and because they have the skills to just sculpt whatever they want, they will pick some obscure historical conflicts like the Carlist War in Spain in the 19th century, which I had never heard anyone wargaming before until they were like, hey, here's a range of miniatures for that, people who follow Games Workshop for a long time, like they know these people, and then when they see what they're doing, it's easier to follow. Also with Warlord and Black Powder specifically, like its rules are descended from a Games Workshop game called War Master, which was a smaller miniatures, but bigger scale Warhammer Fantasy Battle game that has then spun off a bunch of other historical games like War Master Ancients, a whole series of World War II games from a different publisher, and all that kind of stuff. So, if you've played War Master, it's easy to pick up Black Powder, for example.
And what are people looking for when it comes to the war game? Is this just about entertainment? I'm always very conscious that it's easy to over historicize things, and my job is to focus on the history and dispel the myths and all the rest of it, which therefore means that it's very important to park that perspective when you come to entertainment. And yes, you can turn around and pick holes in a film, and yes, you can turn around and say that a novel's not quite right, and you can sort of turn around to a war game and say, well, look, there are issues here, but the fact remains that these things are designed first and foremost to entertain. So do you get people for whom it's purely about entertainment? Are people looking for something sort of semi-historical because they've got an interest, but they want to develop it further, they want to get a little bit of a feel for it? Or is actually realism something that's seen as key, bearing in mind, kind of part of the joy of this, and I do mean joy, is to spend your hours with your delicate little paintbrushes, making sure that you get the braiding right and that you get the little kind of finesses on uniform cuffs and so on. Absolutely right. So do you see sort of camps within the historical wargaming community, or do people just go, whatever? What are they looking for?
Well, so yeah, I mean, it varies. Everyone to some degree is interested in the history, obviously, or they wouldn't be there in the first place. But there is a through line in most game design, across different sorts of games, of realism versus playability. So in the 70s, there was like a big move in realism in miniatures games. And things got really complex in there because they were trying to get so granular, in the games, that it just led to increasing complexity, which led to longer games and a bigger time commitment, and at a certain point, depending on the person, it's just a loss of fun, when it's like, well, great, we're very accurately simulating something here, but oops, it's not fun. But it's like a sliding scale. So there are very much people who, they want everything like as exact as they can make it. And other people, are looser about such things. It's like, particularly when you're making an army, a lot of people, they want to generally have like a historical army. So like, I want a French Napoleonic army. They're not necessarily looking for, I want to make units from like this corps in this campaign in these specific units. They just want a force that will generally work, in as many campaigns as possible. So in any given battle, like the facing or the uniform details won't necessarily be accurate to the units that were there, but they don't care. But other people really do. It's definitely true that there are people who will be extremely judgmental to you, if you do not have those details correct. So
this is not something that surprises me in the slightest.
Yeah.
Let's go back to talk a little bit about the history of the war game genre and kind of the link with Napoleonics. I'm very conscious that 1970 Waterloo, I believe it's 1970, Waterloo comes out. And then there's this sort of explosion in interest in Napoleonics. I don't think it's an accident that Airfix suddenly bring out a Waterloo Airfix set. That's just a very, very savvy marketing move. Does that therefore help with the growth of miniatures as a wargaming hobby? How are the two linked?
Waterloo certainly got many people into wargaming. I remember watching it when I was young, right? And there's all those scenes in the movie where they'll show like Rod Steiger as Napoleon, and he's talking like like you might at a war game table where he's like, oh, I see Wellington has, sent in his heavy horsemen. I will counter with my Polish lancers and, this kind of stuff. It's a very short step from that into, ooh, how can I do that? And that's, hey, miniatures games. But the Napoleonic side of modern miniatures games was really in there from the start back in the 50s. So I'm sure probably some of your other guests have talked about kind of the origin of wargaming going back to like the Prussian general staff, in the early 1800s and all that kind of stuff. And there's a professional side of wargaming, that just continues to the present day where people war game out actual war. And that's different. So, what started in the 50s was the idea of just wargaming, and not for soldiers who, need to learn to make war, but people who just wanted to recreate history, have a fun game, and, that kind of stuff. So what we call hobby gaming really started in the 50s. The first hobby game was called Tactics. It was a board game from a guy named Charles S. Roberts. He founded the company that would become Avalon Hill, and then they were a leader in board wargaming, for decades, till Hasbro bought them. But right around that same time, the beginnings of miniatures gaming were happening. And at the time, they used the classic 54 millimeter size toy soldiers that you would get from Britons primarily, and which are big, and they also could be Stendy, but they were essentially playing variants of H.G. Wells' game Little Wars from 1913, which is a great milestone in popular wargaming, but it had limitations. The only way you could shoot an enemy miniature was by taking a 4.7-inch naval gun that they produced that actually shot wooden dowels. And so, in Little Wars, you fire those and you have to hit and knock over enemies to cause casualties. So, if you're a painter, say, you're like, oh my God, no, you can't knock over my beautifully painted miniatures with a wooden dowel.
You'll chip the paintwork, man. What was the designer thinking?
Yeah. But, the other weird thing about Little Wars is, even though it was commonly Napoleonics that people would play with it, all those musket armed troops never actually got to fire. They could engage in melee, but they didn't actually ever shoot their muskets, which obviously is problematic if you're trying to do Napoleonic gaming. So in the 50s, people kind of started with Little Wars and began coming up with just all sorts of variants, and trying to add more realism and all this and that. And so there were key developments in both the United States and in the UK. The UK was a little more organized in that there was a wargaming section to the British Model Soldier Society, and they had a publication called the Bulletin, and sometimes war game articles would appear in there. But in America, there wasn't that sort of structure. So we had a guy named Jack Scrooby who would become a key figure in all this. And he basically started meeting other people who were wargaming through collector shows and that kind of stuff. And then, looking at the problem of these larger miniatures where it's I want to do a big battle, but these Britons miniatures are big and you can't get that many on the table. There's pictures of H.G. Wells in his parlor, with hundreds and hundreds of these Britons figures, where it's well, guess what? Most people don't have a parlor the size of H.G. Wells' parlor, so it's not that realistic. So Scrooby started making his own miniatures that were 30 millimeters in height, because you could just get more of them on the table. And he also, because people were always asking him, what do I do with rules? He published a pamphlet. It's like a 16-page pamphlet called All About War Games. That was basically like, here's how you war game. But it wasn't like, these are my defined rules. It was like, here's 4 ways to do movements. Here's multiple ways to do combat. And your job is basically like, mix and match the stuff you like and use this as a basis for designing your own war game that suits your taste. And then the 1957, like all this stuff happened with Scrooby. The other big thing they did was start a publication called War Games Digest. And that was really the first like miniatures gaming focused publication. And its initial subscriber list was literally like 40 people. But amongst those 40 people were, names that would later become very recognizable as miniatures war games developed. So, Donald Featherstone, Tony Bath, Joe Morshauser, Larry Brom, they were all early subscribers. And that gave the wargaming community on both sides of the pond like a place where they could share ideas and interact. And after a couple of years, Featherstone and Bath began to edit 2 of the 4 issues a year. So it would alternate, basically being like American team, UK team, and so on. It was a lot. So quite a lot that was happening there in the late 50s. And Napoleonics was really always like a very popular period, for a variety of reasons. Like,
planning for your next trip? Elevate your travel style with Quince. Quince has all the jet-setting essentials you'll want for your next getaway, like European linen, premium luggage options, buttery soft Italian leather bags, and so much more. And it's all priced at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe and ethical manufacturing practices. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials you'll be wearing for vacations to come with Quince. Go to quince.com/trip for free shipping and 365-day returns.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
One important thing is like Napoleonic Wars, you had 3 like co-equal branches, right? You've got infantry, cavalry, artillery, and there isn't really a primacy amongst them. So you have a lot of good interactions like that. There's no machine guns on the board or anything like that. The uniforms, let's be honest, a lot of miniatures is about visual spectacle. So, people love to see, hundreds of minis on a table. I think part of it also had to do with the fact that almost all of these guys served in World War II. So like Donald Featherstone, he was in a tank regiment in North Africa. Joe Morshauser is an American designer. He was part of the crew of a flame tank in the Pacific Islands campaigns. So you can imagine the horrific stuff that you might have seen firing jets of liquid fuel into caves full of Japanese soldiers, right? So I think Napoleonics were also like a safe and distant war, which of course like was horrific in different ways, but it wasn't going to remind them of their recent experiences. Just, not to say they didn't do World War II wargaming, like they did that as well, but I think it's nice to just kind of get away from horrors you may have seen yourself in recent times. From there, things developed with just lots more games. There is a true game industry character from Ohio named Duke Seyfried. And Duke was like super into Napoleonics. He published a game called Melee in 1960, which was one of the first games to try to get in like a little more realism, a little more period tactics and that kind of stuff. And in like 62, 63, like in Dayton, he was running Napoleonic games with like 8,000 miniatures on enormous tables.
Wow.
Yeah, it's bananas. But like Duke, he wasn't just like, I like war games. He was like an innovator, a raconteur, somebody who really like was important in selling the idea of miniatures games to people. And so he did stuff like spend a couple years like just living out of an RV, going from store to store and putting on like demonstration games. He's the guy who first packaged like a complete unit in a single box or plastic clamshell, so you could just be like, like, here's a company, boom. He coined the term adventure gaming. That was him. And he had a company called Heritage Miniatures, did historical and fantasy. Some of my very first miniatures were Heritage fantasy miniatures. So, important dude, endlessly enthusiastic, real promoter of Napoleonic stuff. But then I guess the most important developments were in the 60s. You start to see the publication of like actual, respectable looking books about wargaming. So two of them came out in 1962. So you had Donald Featherstone's War Games, which is, seminal book, still often talked about and pointed to. It covered 3 different periods. One of them was horse and musket with, a focus on Napoleonic stuff. And then across the pond, Joe Morshauser did a book called How to Play War Games in Miniatures, which was similar in that they were introductions to the whole hobby, and also had some rules in them as well. So that's really the point where wargaming became like more of a business. In the 50s, it was like almost embarrassing to commercialize your hobby. Like it was generally the expectation that you were going to design your own game. And if you went to a friend's house to play a game, you'd play his rules. If he came to your house, you'd play your rules. So they didn't even name their rules. Like when I was first getting into researching this stuff, people would be like, oh yes, we played Tony Bath's Ancients rules in the 60s. And I'd be like, cool, let me look those up. What are they called? They didn't have a name. They were just Tony Bath's rules. So anyway, so all throughout the 60s, Napoleonic gaming was very important to miniatures games as a whole, helped it grow. And then in the 70s, there was a lot more competition on the Ancients side of things. There was a big move to making Ancients games more realistic, largely from a company called War Games Research Group. They had a whole tournament scene and all this kind of stuff. But still, Napoleonic games kept going. So obviously, this is a huge amount of history. I can't summarize it in 10 minutes, but I think you get the idea.
Absolutely. Is it fair to say that something went wrong to lead to some kind of a decline? My sense, and this is just my sense, is that certainly wargaming, historical wargaming, as opposed to fantasy wargaming, isn't something that certainly pre-pandemic was seen as mainstream. Certainly during my adolescence, the focus was on 40k, particularly Warhammer 40k, maybe Lord of the Rings, based off of the films that came out, courtesy of Peter Jackson. And so the focus was there rather than on the Napoleonics. Had I known as a 14-year-old that you could paint Napoleonic figures, I might have just died of excitement. So, is it fair to say that there was some kind of decline? And equally, has there been a revival as people have sort of rediscovered the joys of this hobby during the pandemic? And I'm thinking that, a lot of people went to airfix kits, other forms of model making in the pandemic. I was certainly one of them. So, is it fair to say that there was originally a decline, and if so, what's the cause of that? And then, conversely, what's the revival been like?
Okay, again, big topic. So one thing to understand about the hobby game industry is that it does have these like larger cycles where one sort of game becomes more dominant than others. And some types of games go through periods of decline, but then they rise again, and this sort of stuff. So at the start of hobby gaming, there was miniatures wargaming and there was board wargaming, and that was basically it. Through the 60s. But then role-playing games began, and they came out of both of those sorts of wargaming. The Dave Arneson's people in the Twin Cities and Gygax's group in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, they were all miniatures gamers, board war gamers. And the roots of role-playing games were in a miniatures game called Chainmail, which came out in 1971. And it was mostly medieval combat, but there was an appendix, and it was like, hey, like if you want to do fantasy gaming like Lord of the Rings, like here's how you can do that, and here's rules for wizards and monsters and all that kind of stuff. That combined with stuff that Arneson was doing with very small scale like incursions into like a castle or dungeon levels and things like that, those sort of things like married together, and that became Dungeons and Dragons. And then started small, very small print run, but as the 70s went on, it became more popular, and then wargame companies began starting fantasy lines of miniatures as well. And the board wargamers and the miniatures people both began to complain somewhat that role-playing was like sucking the air out of the room, and they saw some decline in those years because the new hotness, was this D&D thing. But then, there have been more cycles like that following. So, TSR was like king of the hill for a long time. In the 90s, Wizards of the Coast, which is here where I live in Seattle, they invented Magic the Gathering. It's the very first trading card game. And that became like a wild runaway success. And that contributed to TSR going out of business. And then they were bought by Wizards of the Coast. When I worked at Wizards of the Coast from 98 to 2002, I started in what was called the TSR product group. And we were the people making role-playing games, within Wizards. But then, at the same time, board games had a comeback, not so much as war games, but, more what are called Euro games. And they're, one of the more dominant forms of gaming today. People often will say gaming when they mean board gaming. And that's, big business, like big companies involved, including venture capitalists, which is freaking weird for something that started, as an individual hobby. But there you go. So anyway, so there was this big move in the 70s and 80s towards fantasy stuff, and historical gaming did suffer. It became, more niche. And it carried on with its own conventions and, lots of new games coming out and so on. But, its popularity like had peaked in the 70s really. But, it's a passionate community. And in the last, 25 years, like things have really changed in the historical gaming scene. It's much easier to get rules and miniatures than it used to be. There have been developments like the introduction of multi-part plastic models into Wargames miniatures. So you can get a box from like Victrix or Warlord. It's got, sprues with all sorts of like heads, bodies, weapons, parts. And they're relatively inexpensive, and you can pose the models how you like in equip them how you like. So there's a lot of utility to that. So, that was like a game changer. And then, there was efforts made to make rules more inviting to new people as well. One big success is a game called Flames of War out of New Zealand, which is a 15mm World War II game. Like that was the game that really popularized World War II as a historical minis style. Like, that got into game stores, which was very rare for historical games like at that time. And another contributor was that Games Workshop itself had a division called Warhammer Historical for a while. And that basically started when Jervis Johnson was like, I wonder if I could do Ancients Wargaming using Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but obviously stripping out all the fantasy stuff. And it worked and lots of people liked it. So for over a decade, they had this subgroup putting out all these different supplements to that and other historical games. And it actually became like a feeder into historical miniatures as a whole, because if they announced like, hey, we're going to do a book about, the Carthaginian Wars, all the small miniatures makers would have an idea when that was coming out. So they'd be like, oh, we have a new line of Carthaginian and Roman miniatures, that would magically come out around the same time as that book. They did like an Old West game, Legends of the Old West, and that led to an uptick in interest in Old West skirmish games. And they ultimately did a Napoleonic game called Waterloo, and that came out in like 2011, and then the year later, Warhammer Historical was shut down. So that didn't really have a chance, but it was a nice intro to the period, kind of a precursor in the way it looked to Black Powder. Actually, the guy designed that, Mark Latham, he designed that game, Chosen Men, that I talked about earlier. So anyway, yes, there were lots of different factors in making wargaming like more popular again. And certainly quarantine was an excuse for lots of people to paint miniatures and, explore other aspects. Also, people were going to game online. So they would use things like Tabletop Simulator, which you can use to play board games and miniatures games with a little bit of elbow grease. So I think that also has been helpful.
I want to talk just very briefly before we start looking at wrapping this up about the community surrounding miniatures, and particularly the historical focus, because you mentioned that some people are very kind of particular about making sure that the facings are correct. Mm-hmm. There are others who just want to play some games. So do you get people who come to this seeking to build their knowledge outwards from their engagement with miniatures? Do you find people sort of kicking against some of the tropes that exist? Or equally, do you see that actually the wargaming genre, because it's there to just enable people to have fun, it doesn't focus too much on the history, and so people take away what they wish to take away from it, and so in some cases that reinforces tropes, in other cases it kicks against it?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, getting into historical miniatures games, like, it's a huge rabbit hole that you can go into as deep as you want to. So, a lot of people will get into it, because they know a little bit about a particular period. And just the process of playing the games, like, it encourages you to do research. It encourages you to learn more deeply about different campaigns, different battles, and things like that. So it's good in that way, in that you will learn a lot. And I think probably everybody who does historical miniatures gaming has, at least like a shelf's worth of Osprey books on very specific titles, like, here's a book that's just about the French Imperial Guard, and, that kind of stuff. Some of them, they are interested in delving even deeper and perhaps challenging some wisdom. war gamers also, like, they really love myth busting, you know, because it shows that they're deep enough into the history, you know, that they can tell you like what things are left over British propaganda from 200 years ago, or, you know, or whatever. So that is certainly a part of it. One of the downsides of the specialized knowledge that you gain is that it can often lead to gatekeeping, which makes it harder to grow the hobby. So, you know, in the 80s, when I first encountered Napoleonic miniatures games, it was very intimidating to me, you know, because it would be like a bunch of older guys around a huge table, you know, with these big rule books and, you know, very, well, in World War II terms, what we call like rivet counters. I guess they'd be like button counters in Napoleonic stuff, you know, like very critical of the smallest mistakes in the miniatures or the painting or what have you. And, you know, like the hobby started as something that was very white and very conservative. And so, and very male as well. And so that has often stopped people who might otherwise be interested from getting into it. So, you know, it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that way. If I may give you a little quote here. So Donald Featherstone wrote this book in the late 80s called Featherstone's Complete Wargaming, which is mostly a general book about wargaming and how to do it. But he interspersed that stuff with stories called Down at the Wargaming Club. And one of those stories is about the dreadful time that a woman got involved in his club and what a disaster that was.
Shock, horror. What are these ladies doing getting involved in wargaming? They'll be wanting the vote next. It's intolerable.
Yeah, so he plays this whole thing off for laughs, like she was a women's libber, you know, like where's my fainting couch and all this stuff. But by his own admission, she knew a lot about military history and Napoleonic gaming in particular. So like, this is what he writes when he talks about her first gaming at their club. Says, Sharon astonished us straight away by recognizing the battle as soon as she heard the narrative. Quote, that's Maida, 4th of July, 1806, when Stuart beat Renier. Yes, that's a nice little battle with the red-coated Swiss being mistaken for Watteville's men and Ross coming ashore with the 20th foot and winning the day. Yes, I'm going to enjoy this. You know, like, I wouldn't look at a board today and be like, oh yes, that's the battle. So, you know, it's like she had an interest, you know, but to hear Featherstone tell it, she like terrorized the club and they started losing members. But then thankfully she went off to found a women's football club and they were free of her. Hurrah. So, I mean, that was very much the attitude back then. And thankfully, you know, things have gotten better in more recent years. Like Games Workshop actually makes a point of showing women and, you know, people who aren't necessarily white, like playing their games and stuff and their rule books and so on. You know, there's at least a wing of the hobby that tries to be more welcoming to people who traditionally have been frozen out of it. I mean, my position is if you're interested and you want a game, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole point is that we're all here to have fun, right? That's quite an impressive quote there. I do like the idea of this woman coming in and just everybody's mouths hitting the floor. There's a woman? Surely not. We must clutch our tweed lapels in disgust at the fact that a woman has got involved. It's intolerable.
And she would beat them regularly, you know.
I love it. I love it. She's got
wherever you are, Sharon,
knowledge.
I salute you.
Absolutely. She's got better historical knowledge. She's got a much better grasp of tactics. I bet her miniatures probably better painted as well. I bet she had a better eye for detail. We do sadly have to wrap this up. But before we do, I just wonder if you could say a little bit about sort of techniques and top tips for those who are starting out in terms of building these kits, creating and painting armies for the first time. What would you say to them?
Okay. So painting miniatures, you know, it can certainly be intimidating. When you see some of the stuff that really the top people can produce, you're like, oh God, like, this is beyond me. But there is something referred to as like the wargaming standard, which is not as beautiful as the top painters can do, but it doesn't actually matter because, like 28 millimeter miniatures are a little over an inch high, 15 millimeter, even smaller. And so, you're most of the time standing, 1 to 6 feet away from the miniatures. So when you look at a unit, like if the basic colors are blocked in right, like it looks good enough, so that's like a good place to start. I mentioned those plastic miniatures, which are kind of a cheap way to start. Just some very basic stuff. If you're going to get into minis and paint them, is like, if you're clipping out things, you want to use a flat clipper so that the extra bit of sprue comes off cleanly. There's something called mold lines, which is where the two halves of a mold come together. And because the seals aren't always super tight, there can be kind of a little line around the miniature. So you want to scrape those off, and you want to undercoat. It's an important step. So like when I started painting miniatures in the early 80s, like I didn't know anything about it. Like I bought Tester's model paints because that's what was in the hobby store. I had no conception of undercoating, So yeah, people debate what colors to use, but undercoating is good, makes the colors pop more.
I horrified my other half the other day so Airfix kits is a slightly different story because they're a plane and they're much bigger and you're dealing with block colors.
Mm-hmm.
But the horror on her face when I told her that I don't do a primer layer, I just paint straight onto raw plastic because I've washed them beforehand, so I've got rid of the oils. And this was beyond her comprehension. Bless her. She was not impressed in the slightest, and then proceeded to educate me in how I should be doing it. So yeah, I've been initiated into this idea of you need a primer. Not convinced by the need for when you're dealing with a Spitfire that's sort of got a wingspan of about a foot wide, but when you're dealing with miniatures, I completely see it because when I have to do the little fiddly bits on a 1:72 scale figure, which as you say is sort of less than an inch high, that's when you feel the need to make sure that the paint sticks properly.
Yes, indeed. And there's been a large like advancement in techniques as well over the years. Like, back in the 80s, early 90s, the sort of standard operating procedure was like, after you get your primer on, you do a base coat of all the colors, you do some washes to add depth, and then you do some highlighting on the peaks, to just make it pop more 3D and stuff. But there's like all kinds of stuff that's happening now. People are doing what's called zenithal undercoating, and this is when you prime a miniature black, and then you use a white spray can, and you decide on the angle that you're gonna spray that, because what you're trying to simulate is the sun hitting the miniature from a particular time of day, and so on. So you then see these miniatures that are like, they're still black on one part, but then there's different gradations as the white paint has come in, and when you paint over that, those areas with the white paint are a little brighter, and that's the sun. Like I've never done that. that's beyond me. But people came in finally from the arts community with applying things like color theory to painting miniatures games, which wasn't really part of it, back when I was first doing things. And then there have been some other innovations that went kind of from the ground up. I don't know who it was, but somebody, I think in the 90s, they had the idea of dipping miniatures into Minwax, the floor cleaner sealer stuff, and then if you let it dry, the color of that would naturally shade the miniature and give it like a thick, like glossy coat, which you would then have to matte spray to get the gloss off. But it was like a one dip process to do all the shading on your miniature. And people just started doing that, buying Minwax and eventually a company called Army Painter, they just started to produce something called Quick Shade, which was that same idea. So you could get different colors of it depending on how light or dark you wanted the shading to be. Then a few years ago, Games Workshop released something called contrast paints. And those are designed so that when you do your base coat, it's both like a solid color, and like a wash at the same time. So you can paint it, and then like the recesses are dark, and the high parts are light. So it basically replaces like 3 steps with 1. So that has been a real help to people. What I would really recommend if you're interested in learning more is go to YouTube. There's tons and tons of videos from painters about how to do it, lots of tips. A lot of game stores and many conventions will have classes on how to paint miniatures. Some of the top painters will do master classes, either online, on YouTube, or in person. You can go to some of the Games Workshop tournaments, and you can sign up to spend hours with a real professional painter giving you tips and as you paint along. So yeah, there's options for you, and YouTube is really like a wealth of advice. So I
some
recommend
top tips there for you folks. If you're, and I hope that has been the case, that you've listened to some of these and have been enthused to get involved with some of these different genres. Chris, this has been a really interesting talk. I like doing these episodes on sort of the history of the public history behind the Napoleonic era. And this is why I wanted to do Wargaming Month, because I wanted something that looked very much at this particular genre that is public history. And people may scoff at that and say, but it's not, designed to teach people the range of a Brown Bess musket. Well, great, but that's not what your average person is after. And I do like the way in which wargaming is a means of getting people involved in this period, sparking that interest, hopefully making them want to know a little bit more. And you've given us a brilliant run through of the history behind the wargaming genre when it comes to Napoleonic. So thank you so much for your time this evening. Where can people find out more about you and what you're doing? Are you on Twitter?
I am. So it's just my last name, at Pramas, Pramas. And my company, Green Ronin, is Green Ronin Pub on Twitter. And I'm on Facebook as well. On my social media, one of the things I did to not go bananas during quarantine was I started doing what I called curated quarantine, where every day I picked a game out of my collection and I wrote about it. And it just started as a lark, something that I thought I might do for a month or two, the first entry was a single tweet. But then quarantine went on and on. And so ultimately, I kept it up for a full year, 365 days, plus some bonus entries. And the entries just got longer and longer. And that became a whole thing, which I may publish through Green Ronin at some point. I would need to revise it to go from social media posts to an actual book. But anyway, that was a time. Green Ronin also published a book called Hobby Games, the 100 Best, which that came out in 2008. We got a bunch of designers to each pick another hobby game that they really liked and write about it. And so some of the old guard were still alive at that time. So we got essays from people like Gary Gygax, some of the old war game designers from the 70s and things like that. So that's an interesting book. And I guess I would be remiss if I did not plug Green Ronin's current Kickstarter. As long as I'm here, we have a new role-playing game called Cthulhu Awakens, which is inspired by the mythos of H.P. Lovecraft, a horror writer from the 20s. It's like our take on things using one of the rules engines that I designed called the Adventure Game Engine. And that is going till March 23rd. So if you're interested in cosmic horror role-playing game, go to Kickstarter and look for Cthulhu Awakens.
Fantastic. There's a lot for people to pick up there. Chris, this has been brilliant. Genuinely, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a treat.
Hello again, folks. A big thank you as ever for listening. And just a quick reminder that you can support the show by hitting the like button, sharing, subscribing so that you can find your way back for more, and leave that review on Apple Podcasts if you can. You can find me on Twitter at ZWhiteHistory. Do get in touch with your thoughts and experiences. And as ever, a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. This month is voted for by my patrons. It's one of the small things that I can do as a very meagre way of trying to thank them for their input and support. If you are interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, please check out the link in the description. Prices start from £1 a month. I know it's a big step to go that extra mile and start supporting the show, but if you are able to, it means a huge amount. There are different perks in each tier. Inevitably, the more that you're willing to chip in, the more the perks. The voting rights start at the Commander tier, and the idea is that every few months there is a vote on what the next theme will be, and then I produce an intense month's worth of content where I more or less double the output of the show to give you a really deep dive into that particular area. There are other perks in other tiers, including being able to request specific episodes on a topic that matters to you, and even one-to-one meetings with me. If all of that's not for you, and believe me, I completely understand that a regular subscription isn't people's thing, then there is another way. So you can leave one-off tips via Ko-fi, and the amount is completely up to you. Anything from, 5p all the way up to, well, whatever you feel the episode and the series is worth. I know it's a big ask, but bear in mind that it is through the tips and the subscriptions that this show keeps going. There are obviously overheads for production. There are all kinds of things, new equipment that's needed, and so on and so forth. And if I'm going to diversify, which is the aim, and to bring you content, particularly from battlefields, I do need your support. It's worth saying that, all of this is done in effect for free. I'm very pleased about the fact that there is no paywall behind it. So those of you who are able to dig into your pockets and show your appreciation in a financial manner, it does mean a huge amount, and it does mean that I can plan for what will hopefully in time be a very exciting future for the show. A big thank you as ever to my Patreon supporters, my Emperor level patrons Mark Stoos, JC Kaiser and Todd and Laird Campbell, my Marshal patrons Matt Bone and Marcus Cribb, my Commander patrons Ger Brown, Liam Telfer, Jane Davis, Bob Burnham and Michael Guest, my Mentioned in Dispatches Plus patron Noah Fink, and my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons Alexandra Leon, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Beatrice de Graaf, Brendan Teeling, Colin Fieldhouse, Ed Koss, Bruins Girl, Gareth Copeland, Jeff Maple, Hugh Brannan, Indiana Fats, James Bevan, Jim Deary, Jim Getz, John Haynes, Josh Keeney, Lucy Tatner, Lynn Dawson, Mark Dewhurst, Mark Anscombe, Rob Griffith, Rory Muir, Ross Flowers, Ryan Diamond, Rob Coquelin and Stephen Coulson. So what can you expect over the course of Wargaming Month? But we're going to explore all kinds of wargaming genres. We're going to look at board games, we're going to look at miniatures, we're going to look at the way in which tabletops work, we're going to look at the computer game as a genre, and look at the strengths and limitations of a specific example there. It's worth saying that the computer game stuff is over on the YouTube channel. There is an apology in advance about the quality of the content of the recording for that. There was a big issue with lag over the course of that recording, and it couldn't be shot twice. We'd already spent about 4 hours of work on it, just in terms of recording, by the point that we got a final product on that. But the conversation that's tied into that will hopefully kind of spark your interest, and you'll at least be able to get an idea of some of the things that we're talking about, even though the footage is painfully jumpy. So do head over to the Napoleonicist YouTube channel for that. So lots for you to look forward to. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Planning for your next trip? Elevate your travel style with Quince. Quince has all the jet-setting essentials you'll want for your next getaway, like European linen, premium luggage options, buttery soft Italian leather bags, and so much more. And it's all priced at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe and ethical manufacturing practices. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials you'll be wearing for vacations to come with Quince. Go to quince.com/trip for free shipping and 365-day returns.